Before we dive in, I'd like to give a quick introduction to our moderators for today's panel discussion. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Heidi Hayes-Jacobs. Heidi is the founder and president of Curriculum Designers. She has helped schools and other organizations create modern learning environments, update curriculum, and support teaching strategies for over 30 years. Her models on curriculum mapping and curriculum design have been featured in more than 13 books and software solutions throughout the world. Please also give a warm welcome to Dr. Marie Hughley Alcock. Marie is the founder and president of Learning Systems Associates. She has worked in public and private education as a teacher, administrator, and public advocate for the last 25 years. She has written more than 10 books on curriculum, instruction, and assessment design, and her focus has been working with schools to improve student achievement, multi-purpose mapping, instructional practices, and more. We're thrilled to have our panel of education leaders with us today. We are joined by Jennifer Mitchell, who is the superintendent of Huntingdon Area School District in Pennsylvania. Welcome, Jen. Can you introduce yourself a little bit more and share your role with curriculum mapping?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. As stated, I am Jennifer Mitchell. I'm superintendent of Huntingdon Area School District. I've been in this role since about November. So I'm wearing a curriculum and a superintendent hat in this district. I don't currently have a director, so I get to wear both of those hats. Prior to this, I've been a primary teacher in kindergarten and really worked a lot in early childhood education. I've been an elementary principal, as well as a curriculum director in 2 other districts. So have been at 3 districts working with curriculum and also working with chalk. And I'm currently located in about central Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Jen, and welcome. We are also joined by Michael Broach, the Vice Principal of Academic and Student Services at Bishop Kenny High School in Florida. Welcome, Michael. Can you share a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So I'm pleased to be joining you this afternoon from Jacksonville, Florida, and Bishop Kenny High School, which is a Catholic college prep high school in the northern part of Florida. And I'm an alum of this school and have been working here for 20 years, first as a substitute teacher, a classroom teacher, an administrator for the last 6 years. Although I still teach a class, it's the best part of my day.
Great, thank you. Lisa Degadio is also joining us today. She is the Director of Curriculum and Instruction at New Dawn Charter Schools in New York. Lisa, can you share a little bit more about yourself?
Hi, everybody. Lisa Degadio. I am started as a founding principal for both of the charter schools that we run, New Dawn Charter Schools. Our first campus opened in 2012 in the Brooklyn area, and our second campus opened in 2019. Right now, I serve as the Director of Curriculum and Instruction for both schools, and I have been working with developing this curriculum since we've opened both schools and working with our staff in this. So it's a real pleasure to be on this panel and learning from everyone today.
Thanks, Lisa. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Daniel Gallant, the Supervisor of Educational Technology at Middlesex County Vocational and Technical Schools in New Jersey. Welcome, Daniel. Can you share a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleased to be here with you all. So as said, my name is Dan Gallant, and my role as administrator is with the Curriculum Instruction Department, but serving with implementation of educational technology, which sits me squarely in front of chalk and helping implement that in my district. Before that, I was a classroom teacher for 16 years, math and science, and I've been an administrator for 3 going on 4 now. So I'm happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. Now, without further ado, I'll hand things off to Marie to get things started.
Hello, everyone. It is an honor for all of us to be here with you, and thank you for joining us for the second part of this conversation. When last our heroes met, we spoke about really, the beginning process of this. We were talking about buy-in. We were talking about how we built a team and a group together to help steer and lead the process. So today, we're really looking forward to getting a little bit more specific about the practices we used, but also to go further into the story about how we build and sustain this kind of work. So our first question to you is really about What were the specific professional development practices that you used, engaged with, and saw as helpful as you really brought staff on board as one part, but also went into the curriculum mapping process? So there might be a lot of layers. Some of you may have done multiple practices. Maybe you found one to be more successful than others. We want to hear about it. Who'd like to start us off?
Sure,
I
I'll
could
go
start.
ahead.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Uh, So when we talked last, I had shared that we already had kind of a good core group who were working on curriculum curriculum mapping. But as far as moving forward into upgrading this process, one thing we did was really try to empower the teachers who were on that team to feel like they owned this process and were sort of the ambassadors of bringing this into the district. Beyond that, we definitely organized many global professional developments that were part of major professional development days, as well as little micro sessions, maybe you'd call them. And I would also meet with teachers one-on-one as we roll this out. And lastly, I had put together a self-paced video guide of my own. I know Chalk has great resources for getting teachers the information they need to use the platform. But curriculum mapping is so specific to not just New Jersey or my school, but even down to a teacher's classroom, that we felt it was necessary for us to make our own guide to how do we use chalk in our district. And so we had put all of that together as we sort of marched this process from pilot to launch.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel. We're going to come back and ask some more questions about that. I'm assuming it was an asynchronous training with the video pieces. We're going to come back, but Lisa, I know you wanted to share with us. Would you like to do that now?
Sure. I just have a lot of comparisons to Daniel in developing a separate sort of like guiding document. I think I'm kind of lucky of the group because we got to create something from paper. We were, had a vision and, opened the school and have been able to make changes as we've grown and developed over time. So that's been a really amazing experience. And we've had the ability to bring people on specifically that, were aligned to our mission and vision. So we didn't inherit a group that we had to bring over to the other side, so to speak, but like hire and bring on people that were willing to get their hands dirty and see us all kind of in the trenches together. So that was like a huge benefit for our group. But as we grew in, and even pre-COVID, we saw the need that additional documentation was necessary, and we kind of brought chalk on right before we went into COVID. So as we started using it, the development of documents and different videos and how to use chalk, but then also how to, break down pacing, because our pacing is very different and is not a traditional model by any means. And so we found that, using that as sort of the springboard was very helpful.
So I'll jump in there. Very similar. I think the most important for us was allocating time, which both Daniel and Lisa kind of alluded to with, pacing things out. So we made a roadmap for the school year, and that's now become a practice, not just for curriculum mapping, but just in general as an administrative team in the summer to say, okay, here's our professional days, here's the time. Let's start having a clear purpose, just like you would plan a lesson or units for a curriculum. Let's plan it for our teachers. Here's what we're going to try to accomplish. We also try to have clear goalposts. So, while we're still being flexible with certain subject areas based on where they were at, but overall to have a clear goal of by this date, we want to be here, and then communicate that clearly and then help provide the time to help teachers get to that point. Another thing that we learned from this process was as we started curriculum mapping, in our unit overviews, we have a section for essential questions. What we found is there was such a wide interpretation of what is an essential question. Some were writing out 50 questions that looked like a study guide, and some had one question. And so we said, oh, we need to give a little bit of training and some explanation of what is an essential question. So it was nice. It lent itself to other professional development that kind of branched out from curriculum mapping.
Yeah, and I will add to that too, because I've had the luxury of, trying to implement this in several different districts of differing sizes. So the first time I had a larger district, and so I really did small pods of teachers that we kind of brought along. What I learned from that was I didn't do as much work as I should have establishing the overall culture and what we believed as a district about what is our curriculum work and how do we define that curriculum work. So when I went to my second district, I actually did a similar piece where I did, of course, we were during COVID time. And so I was able to utilize a recording that I did that really talked about what is curriculum, what do we believe? It was actually very brief. It was only a 30-minute for the entire district to kind of lay that foundation to do that piece. So that was a learning tool for me, that start big and then go to those small groups. But I too believe that as you get into the process of it, what you'll find is subgroups of people will need various different things for professional development. So maybe it's something on understanding the standards, or maybe there are new standards coming out. We need to take a really good look at them and understand them as a group. Maybe it's understanding the importance of assessment and the different forms of assessment and how does that fit in. What about strong evidence-based instructional practices? Do we have a good handle on those? Because those things all impact how we write curriculum and the quality of the curriculum. So, I've been in the process of writing curriculum with groups and had to stop and say, you know what, let's take a pause and let's take this, other street and do some professional development on these types of things to kind of help us get to a point where we can come back to the curriculum work.
May I, let me just ask something here. In a little bit, not quite yet, we want to take a deeper dive into what makes quality. Just because somebody puts something into a map doesn't make it really very useful. I mean, there's a lot of cut and paste that occurs, or drive-by. Do you know what I mean? And to get to quality is really important, but I want to save the specifics on that for a minute and go a little further with what you're asking or talking about, because there's a really practical question here, and that has to do with scale. That some schools will say, you know what, we're going to start with one subject. You know what I mean? Like, let's just start with what we need most in elementary. It'll usually be ELA or math or something like that. Or someone will say, our high school, we're going to start with one department, or we'll have each teacher start with a course. So sometimes you're going to work on that level, but other places, and I'm thinking right now of a very large district I'm working with in Texas. It's new. I've just started with them. They're large, and they aren't going to have every single teacher mapping out their individual curriculum. The question here is, should they have a subgroup that does the writing on a consensus map, then teachers make their adaptation? That there's a lot of questions that people ask, very practical questions, not beyond just how do we prepare the PD, but what's the scale of the starting point? And how did you wrestle with that initially when you started to lay out your PD, or did you just try to map everything? I'm just kind of like to hear from you on that.
Sure. Well, as far as scale goes, when we started the project and we were in the pilot phase, when the decision was made that we would go forward with a full launch, we're a smaller district. So when I say we're going all in and all wheels are up and we're doing everything at once, it's less of a lift than probably a district you're talking about that you're working with in Texas. We're 2,000 students across 5 buildings, 6 schools. But that's kind of how it went for us. We realized, okay, we're really going with this next year. So what does it look like to be fully launched in September of the current school year? So we had, made some measurable goals, like Michael was saying earlier, and started mapping that out for ourselves.
Let me ask you this, follow up on that. Did you start with, and I think that's, it's really more just for information. Did you say, there's a practical question here. say I'm a high school teacher and I have 4 preps. Are you saying, did you say we're going to start slow the first year? That's kind of like everybody does one course and does it well versus let's just go and throw everything in the water. I think this is one of the most important questions right now. It's so important to administrators and to the success. I'm really curious to hear how you handled that.
Yeah, I would say I got a little bit of pressure from my principal team. I was a curriculum and instruction person. And so I got a little bit of pressure from my principal team to kind of hurry up and get the work done. And then the suggestion was, could you do this like on in-service days, right? Because as Michael brought up, you're trying to find time. And so I was like, sure, I can do this. I can handle this. So I took, English teachers, a group of art teachers, which were K-12. I took a group doing algebra. I took probably on a handful of 7 to 8 groups of people at our high school, which were all sets of teams, and did that on in-service day and brought them in and tried to work them through this and showed them chalk and went over the map and what are best practices in curriculum. And then I set them to work. And what I quickly found was that was too much. And I said, well, we've taken on too much, because I couldn't support all of those teams at once and they had needs. So I kind of liken it to when we instruct in the classroom, it's the I do, we do, you do. And so I found that I had to be very present. This isn't something you can assign folks and walk away and then hope that it's really quality. You have to stay with them during this process. Now, there were times that I would start groups, I would give them some space, walk away and say, you know what, I'm going to go do something else, or I'm going to check on this or that. I'll be back, have your questions, and then let's review what you've gotten done for today and help them where they were getting stuck. But you really have to be there with them in order to get really good quality work.
I think it also helped. So we scaled it we set checkpoints of, we want to do the unit overviews first. Actually, we really started with, what are your units? And it was amazing with some teachers that all teach the same course, and there are some different interpretations of that. So we had to start with, what are our units? And then our unit overviews. But then I had to be flexible with, I think I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, our world language teachers, some of whom teach all 4 levels, they said, you know what, can we focus on level 1 first? And let's make that good. And then let's build up to level 2. Absolutely, because at the end of the day, we're talking about what we're teaching and what skills we want our kids to have. I also provided a sample. So at the time that I was transitioning into administration 6 years ago, I was still teaching US history. So I spent a summer, and because I had been the lead US history teacher, I built one out as an example, got feedback on it, and then was able to show these are the types of elements we're looking for. So even I put a sample in ours of a fake subject, and there's some funny things in there like history of our school, but just to, again, to demonstrate to teachers this is kind of where we're going, so they could see a vision, because it's intimidating when they think of explaining what does curriculum mapping mean. It's a new term. So really it's, I guess, breaking down the barriers a little bit to help people understand the process and feel comfortable and excited about it.
To build off of that piece, Michael, I really appreciate you bringing up kind of the non-discipline specific map. I think there was a time where there was a little bit of mythology around the professional development, where you would just do a keynote and we would give a common message of what the skills were, of what curriculum mapping was, and then magically, and then just everyone would get going and we would check in with them. And what I appreciate, and I know, Lisa, we're coming to you next, but what I really appreciate about what I'm hearing here are tools about how to sustain the work, like those asynchronous videos and documents. And we've learned to make them shorter and shorter and shorter. I'd love to hear more about, what you learned was most effective there. I'm hearing you talk about differentiating it for your different groups, all the way down to different teachers. I'm hearing you say that you have to be present. It's not like keynote and then drop the mic, right? It's this idea of really having it be ongoing professional development of all sizes. And then Mike, you're talking about there, we used to have, Heidi and I used to do a unit map called the fork map. It was just about utensils. And the funniest thing we used to do with that is it really put the structure of the map, which I know we're going to be getting into, where it's not too close to an emotional connection with the discipline. And we used to have them teachers take that map and deconstruct it and put it together like a puzzle. And this finds out, do they know what essential questions look like? Do they know what content might look like? Do they know what an assessment might look like? So there's also this role of giving feedback to them after the professional development. So I'd love to hear also some ideas about how did you follow up on the professional development and give them that feedback on those quality pieces as we go forward. Lisa, thank you. This is the best I've heard about professional development in a long time. I really appreciate all of you.
So we really use chalk as a vehicle for our ongoing professional development. So we have our whole group sessions, but then principal teams and myself go in and review the lesson plans that folks post weekly. And in most cases because we're every other week, it's cohort based, so it's every other week. And we each look at something different. So, from my lens, I'm looking at alignment. So are you writing a lesson plan that's aligned to the framework of the course? Whereas our principals are going in and they're evaluating the meat and potatoes, the procedural parts. Are they including everything that needs to be done in a classroom that's going to engage students, yada, yada, yada. And then, the other part of it is then getting feedback from folks about the equity and the access piece. Are there enough materials in the unit that appeal to our audience, our students, our clientele? I think that's what, Maria, I think you used that the last time, students as clientele. Are we writing for them? Are we, building those things? So it's just an ongoing, we talk about curriculum being living, breathing document, like this is the reason for it, right? To ensure that folks are on board, but we're also making on the ground changes when something is stagnant and needs some changing up.
Thank you. That was terrific round. We've already started to dip into the question of quality, which is another thing we wanted to go into. And I noticed, Michael, you were very keen on mentioning what I would call elements, compositional elements. Any composition has elements, and you put those together. So whether you're writing music, you choose the notation, the melodic line, harmony or not, dissonance, choice of instruments. Architects use elements, scale, perspective, material, so forth. We do too. And so for us, and I've written about this a lot, we view the act of curriculum making as compositional, that you're choosing the elements. There's 5,000 ways you could teach the American Revolution, if not more. And so you're putting these things together. And just because somebody does put in elements doesn't make them of good quality. And one key thing is they're responsive, as you just mentioned a moment ago, Lisa, very responsive to the student, that you're not writing generically. You're making choices for your student population. You take texts, you adapt those texts to your student population. But even so, I think the essential question point was a really good one, because I would say that's true of all the elements, that, it's the difference between a good instructional question and an essential question. We believe in internal alignment. Does it align internally? External is your standards, but internally, do the assessments reflect what it is you want your kids to know, be able to do? How much detail goes into the map? What about the language and terms? It sounds like a lot, but it's really not. What's hard is when you don't know about the elements. Then you're just trying to go, what do I put in here? So one question that I have about this is most adult learners don't like things foisted on them. They do like guidance. So it's sort of the question of how do you establish a kind of collaborative sense of we all kind of know what quality is. I loved what you said, Jennifer, about getting them started. It isn't that he was leaving the room. It was that they still are kind of, this is a different form and we want feedback on it. And outside eyes can see something we miss. How do you determine what kind of quality, what elements did you think were most important? how did you sustain that, or how do you continue to do that with feedback? Do teachers give each other feedback? I'm just sort of the question of quality feedback elements. Any comments on that? Any areas that were particularly challenging, sort of things like that, too? Be really curious.
I think people are delicate.
Hmm.
And so we have to tread delicately when we look at this on all cases, because when you create something or you write something, you're putting a lot of yourself into that plan, whether it's, very thoughtful and detailed, or if it's short and sweet. And so I think, when you look at quality and you look at big picture items, when you're providing feedback, you really have to keep your audience member in mind. I tend, because I read a lot of plans, and, I'm reading for 2 buildings, I tend to be, very bulleted and, concise as much as I can be in some cases. But I also do find myself, because I have been the architect of the essential framework, that when people are way off course, I tend to get a little bit more detail in my feedback. When you reflect on that, and that's where the principals come in and be like, you really verbally dumped all over this lesson plan, let's dial it back, have a meeting, and talk about it, because it happens, right? And so I think we have to be mindful of that, because as critical as we want to be to push people to be better quality, because what you plan is what's happening in the classroom, you also want to make sure that they're along on the ride with you, and that they know that the feedback they're getting is going to make them better, or that the product that they're giving to our kids is better and that engages kids. So ultimately, I think we just have to look at that big scope first and then scale it down from there.
I love that you touched on that, because the one fear was, if, as I was looking at the curriculum maps, it's that careful balance of, am I giving helpful feedback to help guide them gently along the way so we have quality work? Or if I'm being too critical, or if I'm pushing the timeline too aggressively, they're just going to get it done and check the box and be done with it, and it doesn't reflect what's happening in the classroom. So what we did is we had kind of like a basic set of characteristics for each of those elements. And then we had the teachers in the departments self-audit. So for example, at the end of each quarter, we have a survey for the teachers, and we usually ask about how are the students performing. We may ask, questions about educational technology. If we've launched something new, how's it going? Just to get some feedback. But we always had a question in there about how is it going with the curriculum? And then that feedback helped us kind of decide how to guide them through. So I really relied a lot on our department chairs to give feedback, and they're a very candid group, which I love. So they'll tell me how it's going. And then, so really it was kind of a continual, let's all self-audit and talk about how it's going and tweak and adjust. And then as an academic team, so we have 3 administrators here in our office. What we did then is that we would have checkpoints, usually twice a year. We would divide up all the departments and we would take a few. So for example, I looked at math and science, and then I would find, because one thing that teachers might not see is that, oh, well, this group did it this way and this group did it this way. So I might have some questions, and then we brought that feedback back to them. And gave them time to say, oh, well, this is why we did it this way, or, oh, maybe that could be written a different way. So that's why our goal of 2 years kind of spread a little bit further. And it's still, it can be a little messy, but I think the best outcome is that teachers have a good handle about what they're teaching, and that they're collaborating and speaking with one another about what they're teaching. So I'm very happy with that.
We were fortunate in our district where there was a lot of emphasis placed on admin who could support instructional. So we actually had 5 different administrators in our central office who, in their own avenue, instructionally, but who could give that feedback, who were, experts on career and technical education, since we're CTE, also content supervisors in the math, science, ELA history, and foreign language. So we had a really strong team there already in place who could provide that kind of, supportive on the ground feedback and working through this process with them. The one thing we really saw that was beneficial to moving to a digital kind of public facing platform for all our maps was it very quickly became self-improving and self-reinforcing because everybody saw the other maps. And seeing a good map, it's obvious when you're looking at it. And that makes you self-reflect on, what does mine look like? And do I hit these same kind of notes when I'm thinking about what I'm putting into my map? And so very quickly it started that kind of process, which is really important for our career in tech ed, because whereas a math department, I might have, 30, 40 teachers across my district, I have one machine tool technology teacher, and he's the one responsible for that map and that curriculum and what goes into that. And really even his supervisors aren't machine tool technology experts. And so having something to help guide his work was really implemental. And so having great samples, like was mentioned, and and good support was really instrumental in moving so quickly as we did.
I think one thing I would touch on, and Lisa talked about, people being delicate and what you do to kind of get that quality. I really like a feature that Chalk added. When I first started using them, they didn't have this feature. And then as they got feedback, had added it, but it's the ability to comment within those maps, right? And it's not just supervisors. Everyone who's working on the map can do commenting. But what I started to do in my commenting was not necessarily to tell them what to do, but to ask inquiry questions. So I tried to force myself to say, how do you feel about this part of the map? Is the map, achieving what you had hoped, it would in this section? I noticed that, you've set up the learning objective for the student to be this, and I'm looking at your assessment section, and I'm wondering, do you have an assessment that will measure what that learning objective for the student is? Because maybe I wasn't seeing assessments that really matched up well. So I started to get much better about, instead of telling them, but asking questions which would lead them to think. And then just like Michael was talking about, and somewhat with Daniel, there are certain people that need to kind of be the keeper of the structure of the map and the how that works, but then also the content. And I knew I was not the content expert everywhere. I couldn't be. So I relied on my department chairs and some of those leads who really knew their content to ensure that the content was accurate.
Let me throw out something. It's a little bit different angle. I've been listening very carefully to what you've said, and I respect the fact that people, I love what you said about people work hard. And I have a slightly different take. Our experience has been, if we treat this as a composition, when you write a composition, do you know who you value almost more than anyone? Your editor. Your editor isn't out to get you. That's the point, is to not feel, that's what you feel, because so many of us have been bruised. That's what I think you were pointing out, Lisa. If I heard you, I went, good point. But if you start off very openly and say, look, everyone needs feedback. Let's agree in advance what quality looks like, picking up on a number of points, a number of you made. And because sometimes people aren't exactly sure. And then your point, Jennifer, you're going to get feedback. But it's going to be pretty straightforward. We have a kind of policy when we work with a district, and that is we will look at one map of every single teacher in that first unit, go in, give the comments, and in Chalk it would be exactly as you said, Jennifer, before they go further. Then they have confidence. In other words, we're there to help the kids. That's what we're really working for. And we find most teachers, if they know where you're really coming from, and that's where it's easier for somebody like us, I get it, as opposed to an administrator or something else. But one school I'll mention, Gulliver Prep, who we both work with in the Miami area, they actually trained a group of teachers to be editors. In other words, in some of those were department chairs. So that what happened is you now know you're going to get a straightforward response. And, an editor gives you feedback. You can take it or leave it. I find teachers love this feedback. They love the attention. And I listen to every one of you and I'm going, they probably thrived. The danger, and this is Mama Heidi speaking here, is for somebody to put a lot of effort and energy to a full year, and they really didn't write essential questions. They really did write maybe 150 interesting questions. They have to do it over again. So I think this discussion we're having, and you each raised such good points, has to do with scale and size. My experience is people want feedback if they know what the intention is, if that makes some sense. Does that resonate for you all?
And to build off of that piece, I'll never forget it. One of my first rounds of auditing maps, I went and presented to the teachers what the findings were. And I had that same nervousness of, well, be careful, be gentle, make them laugh, all these things. One gentleman stood up and in front of the whole group, he was very emotional. And he said, regardless of anything we found, thank you for reading our work.
That's right.
He's like, we've been working on this for 2 years. And until now, no one has done anything with it. So even if someone just reads the maps and leaves a positive, wow, really good essential question, or look at this piece. I think teachers want that validity of, if I'm going to put this much effort in and put this out here, tell me you're going to look at it. So I just want to thank you all for being the kinds of leaders that actually read the maps. And I'm watching you be nervous about the quality of your feedback. I'm just happy you were there. So thank you for that piece. And we can continue that conversation in that piece. But I want to add, we're talking about what you as leaders, right, we're experiencing there. As we continue this conversation, could you add a little bit about what the teachers said they were concerned about? I think there's a balance here, and we could benefit, the audience could benefit from us shifting that perspective.
Well, and I feed off of that, I think that was one of the pieces. They, like when I talked about not scaling too large, that they need you, they want, teachers want to do a really good job, and they tend to be perfectionists sometimes. And so they want it to be really good, and they have to be okay with the work being messy. And also allowing them, allowing them that creativity, right? Because sometimes the way I envisioned it going wasn't at all where it went. And they had much better ideas than what I did, but I was providing that structure for them to not let them get off track with what really are essential questions, or what are those main pieces they must have and how they link together. So I think, setting the structure for them and what the parameters are, allow them to flow into that creative place. And again, not letting them get too far into the work. And that's kind of that piece of, okay, 1 unit and 1 unit only before you get some feedback, or one component. I heard even Michael saying, like, look, we just worked on unit overviews. And then we talked about that, so that they're really having success and feeling comfortable, and then they see it in manageable chunks.
So we had this in a similar way, but we kind of had it in 2 different avenues, because we had our curriculum teams who were phenomenal, and just give them a different vehicle and they're going to run with that. And so we had that experience on that side of it. But as far as helping teachers get there, all the rest of the teachers who weren't part of that crew, there was some, initial here and there feedback of, well, I was always doing this over here in this space, and now you're telling me we as a district are going over here and we're going to start doing it this way in this space. So there was that, but doing a lot of the things we've already talked about, like small group potting and PD, and meeting them where they are PD, and the asynchronous PD, like all of that together helped that. So something we did in that way was we held a large session prior to the current school year, because this was our launch year, where we actually had something on the order of 30 teachers across all buildings and across all disciplines come. And really the goal was, on like day 1 of that session, was write me a lesson plan in this platform, and let's all talk about what that looks like. and let's explore how we use this tool, to accomplish the things that we're all good at doing, but over here in this space. And we got that one lesson plan done. And then we moved on to looking at the unit and how it looks going forward day to day. And so we took those steps with them, hands-on PD with them, and helped get past some of that anxiety of moving to a new thing, or I want to be over here where I've always done this. Why am I coming over here? So demonstrating the power of something like this and why, as a district, we all decided to move this way was really helpful with our teachers.
Well, I'll jump in and a lot of the same thing as we've talked about time with teachers. Anytime it's something new, it's one more thing. So that was definitely a fear. Another one was the fear. Well, it was twofold. One, you touched on it already about teachers love feedback, and the system we had before curriculum mapping, a complaint was we're doing all this work and I'm not sure anybody ever reads it. Now they know that we do read it and we look at it and we get feedback and we discuss it. So that has become much more valuable. But the other fear that really came out the first couple of years that we did this was they were afraid of losing autonomy. They were afraid that if we're going into this curriculum mapping where it's all transparent, that their teaching would have to become more scripted. And so really we had to reassure them that curriculum mapping, it's a moving target. It's just like a teacher's always refining and improving instruction, we're always refining and improving the big picture of what we're teaching from start to finish. And so when we got them to think about that, is really it's helping you to lead the roadmap of where students will start your course, where they'll finish, how this class relates to the next, and that you're working collaboratively with your colleagues and you get to shape that. For example, the first year we did curriculum mapping, I'll never forget, the biology teachers came to see me and they said, we've really been talking about, I forget what unit it was, we just feel that it would be better at the beginning of the year. And I said, that's fine. Are you looking for my approval? Because you don't need it. You're designing your map. If you've got the standards and you've got the learning objectives, go for it. And there's a sense of relief and maybe a little shock of that, oh, right? So I think that was just a fear, when you start something new of, am I losing some control?
Yeah, I could jump in on that. That is probably one of the bigger things for us because of our cohort-based, teams of kids. And so chunking and prioritizing curriculum is huge, especially for Regents exams in New York. And so, we've made shifts. A great example, going back to you, Michael, you were talking about your science team. Our global studies Regents came out and it's 10th grade test, but because our kids are so interrupted, they don't necessarily get everything in sequential order. They get it piecemeal. And so for us, we flipped the actual 10th grade curriculum so that the last half was first and the first half was last, because that was the heavy content that we see on the exam. And so, it's just that, ability to work with somebody and say, oh my goodness, look at this, we need to make some decisions about what we're going to do and enact it and, give people the space and say, hey, listen, June's Cummings, first run of Regents that we've had in a year. And so for a lot of our kids, it's, trying to keep things bite-sized. In fact, I saw something, we're going to roll it out tomorrow. I was sitting on the plane and I saw this writing contest, 100-word microfiction contest. And I'm like, you know what, we're going to do that for Regents writing, because our kids are so afraid of writing the wrong things and, putting something in bite size and say, you know what, I can answer that question with a piece of evidence and outside information in 100 words. I can do that. And then we can build it from there in the next couple of weeks. And so, it's like stuff like that we can sit and talk about and bring people on and have people try things out and say, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. We'll figure something else out. So I think that's also the beauty of having a mapping system too, is that you have this constant reflection and, oh, I just saw this, let's try this. And let's flip this order. We do this all the time. And so it's just great to be able to do that with our staff and be reflective in that way.
Wonderful example, Lisa. Great idea to diffuse the anxiety through doing that's great. But what you just talked about is the naturalness of this. That's one thing I think a lot of folks go, you know, what you somebody mentioned, a couple of you mentioned the perfecty thing that goes on like, oh, that's good. There's no such thing as perfect. It's called life, and you're laying out this composition you're going to try to build, and there's going to be adjustments. You build a building, and there's a rock in the foundation. You got to figure out what you're going to do. And so I think that's a really interesting attitude to take. Like, this is a place where we get to work through reality and really be responsive to the kids. I loved what you just said. That was great. You know, along those lines, one of the questions we wanted to get into, this is sort of a good place, I think, to shift to this question, is something we talked about our last time about the purpose of mapping isn't just to have maps, it's to use them. And we were talking about the review process and how once you get some maps under your belt, you can start to review them. Gap analysis, you know, take a look at some of the issues you have. Maybe it's alignment to standards. Maybe it's redundancy. Maybe it's the testing question, in a sense. But we were wondering if you have regular reviews, sometimes vertical, maybe sometimes cross grade level, how do you set those up, and how are you sustaining mapping in that regard? So it's using them. And just put on the table how different ways you're using them, and that's why, Lisa, what you just said was a great transition, because you were showing how you were using them in a very real way. We'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. So our old solution was very outdated. You thought you were looking at a 1980s internet page, probably, where the teachers were writing. And so when they were grabbing standards, maybe they were up to date to the state, but they had to filter through a bajillion of them to get to the ones that they wanted. And then there was no tracking for you to do analysis of, did my map get me to where I was? Did I, cover what I meant to cover? Something we were able to institute now that we've got some solid maps running in our district is using the tools that are in this platform to actually have the teachers self-assess, because they can pull up their own set of standards. Like, what have I covered? What part of the maps were effective and what standards were hit? And they can actually self-assess and also bring those conversations into their PLCs with, their cohorts and their, content supervisors. So it's definitely helped supercharge that conversation. It's not that we weren't having those conversations before, but now we have really aggregate data to actually bring to those conversations, and not just, anecdotally, this is how I feel it went and here's what I think I covered. Like, you can actually look and say, no, I covered this to here. And so it's been nice to move those conversations into a much better data driven conversation.
In one of my districts, there was this very elaborate curriculum review cycle. And it was about when I got there, it was like, oh, we are up to date. We've done all these reviews. There's only these content areas that need reviewed. But then I went to look at their maps, and I was very shocked that the maps weren't up to date. And so we were reviewing English, grade 7 through 12, or we were looking at music K to 12, but we weren't attending to, so we go through this elaborate process of creating this document to say, yes, we've done this review, but we never really got to the work of refining the maps or making the maps work or be responsive to students. And so that really got me thinking that, this whole process of what we call curriculum review is very outdated. And we were spending a lot of time on unnecessary things. And when I took that away and said, no, this is really what curriculum review is about, people were freed. People actually got to the point of where they felt comfortable enough to come and say, this isn't working. Could we find time to look at this curriculum map? Could we next summer get together as a group? And I had in my mind, when had we last? We would publish things in chalk, and I could tell what those dates were, and I'd keep a kind of a spreadsheet of when was it last updated, knowing when the new standards were coming out, et cetera, where the target areas needed to be, or looking at data to say, oh, we're not getting, and have conversation about why not, and what do we do based on the data that's coming into us. For example, we were struggling with math. So we wanted to look at those from a K-12 perspective. But I think that allowed a much different discussion than just this very rigid, we're going to review it, we're going to write it, we're going to board approve it, and now we're going to move on to the next con.
I think Daniel and Jennifer both talked about different vehicles and like how we use this to push ideas forward and skills forward. And for us, it's, it's about making sure that the vehicle works. And so, not everything will be a Lamborghini. It might be, a broken down Toyota, but it's going to go from one place to the next. And when we look at like the idea for us, because our kids have such interrupted experiences in high school, we don't take a traditional, trajectory. So we have to really look at, a big span of skills to back build while we're trying to front build to get them over a hump of an exam or whatever else. And so, that idea of vertical and horizontal alignment is very, very important for our vehicles because our kids have to go backwards and forwards sort of at the same time and try to, backfill a little bit. And so I think, from that standpoint, being less about, the accountability and the onus of, holding someone responsible for something that may not be great. We'd rather take the old Toyota and move it forward a few more feet if we know that that's going to get our kids, further along and in a safe space. For us in particular, I mean, we haven't really talked about it as much, but even post-COVID, like, social emotional learning is very, very important, not only for our kids, but for our staff. Like, people are still COVID tired. And we want to make sure that we're putting things in place that are going to, move ahead and not create additional stress. So I think that, for Daniel, Jennifer, Michael, everyone here has really discussed that knowledge of working with their teams and ensuring that, we're keeping the kids in mind, but we're doing things that make sense. And we're not just throwing a bunch of things at the wall and hoping that one of them will stick. And so I think that's really the most important thing for anyone looking at, alignments and moving curriculum forward as a vehicle is that it's got to be something that's going to work and is going to stick and have traction so that you can build upon it as you grow as a group.
I couldn't agree more. And I like the common theme of, for here, it was always, we review curriculum every 5 years. So your department is now up. And now it's not that anymore. It's the living, breathing digital document that we're always kind of invested in all the time.
Yeah, there's almost something absurd, totally absurd about saying every 5 years we'll do science. I mean, you gotta be kidding me. It's, there's not going to be any writers for 5 years, so you can put your feet up, English teachers. It's just habit. And it was the textbook industry, to be perfectly blunt. I think a lot of it was driven by that. And the shift is there. Also, that practice really dated way pre internet-based tools. That is just old, curriculum binder stuff. And so it's good to see it shed. But it isn't a free-for-all. It doesn't, this is where having these tools pay off. That was a really good round. I really found that valuable. I know that looking at the time, Sarah, how are we doing? You want to get to some of these questions? What you're thinking right now?
Yes, let's start the Q&A. We've got some great questions here. One of the things that was mentioned earlier in today's session was the fork map that I believe Heidi, you had mentioned. Marie or Heidi, can you guys elaborate a little bit on that? When somebody was asking if you'd be able to share it with the people attending today so they can see.
Actually, Marie brought
Sure.
up the work map, which I'd totally forgotten about.
No, sure. Happy to quickly share it. It's and we're not putting it forward as an ideal template or anything like that, but it was just a tool used, and I'm happy to share my screen, that whatever template you end up doing, really putting a sample together that's not disciplinary specific. And tell me when you can see my screen.
You're good.
Okay, so in this case, right, so we got the fork and they were talking about the title, culture in a utensil, that unit overview sample that we were speaking about. They did align standards. And then whatever your expectations are. So in this case, see how they were using color coding to kind of align the big ideas to essential questions. And they happen to be aligning to, I guess the CLIs were, the CLI here references the capacities of a literate individual, which was a conversation this school was having. If I scroll down, you'll see that they continued that color coding. So the blue here would align to what that blue big idea was. There was internal alignment. I think, Lisa, you were talking about being, the champion of alignment. And this idea of really don't get lost in the details of what the content is here. The idea is about what Heidi was talking about. These are the essential components of what we're building. Do we recognize the format? Do we recognize? We had teachers who were sometimes putting things that weren't questions in the box, essential questions. And you say to yourself, it says it's a question. Why are you putting a list of content? But you get so wrapped up in the details, right? That sometimes we lose sight of the forest for the sake of the tree. And so we sit here, notice in stage 2, they were talking about depth of knowledge here or summative informative. And they were really thinking about the alignment. Lisa, I dedicate this to you. The alphanumerics here are actually aligning back to another part of the map. Again, that was a tool that they were using. Now, Chalk has that built in, which is fantastic. But these are pieces that they went into. And all we did was cut this up. And we used to go back and forth. We were like, should we keep the word learning targets with it? Or, should we separate all the pieces? We even color coded it. But having faculty go through the process of constructing and deconstructing what your expectations are with a safe sample can really build their confidence in ways that us constantly giving them feedback on their content area might be running into barriers that we don't have the time to work through. And so happy that you asked about it, and we encourage you to use a tool like this when you need to.
Yeah, I think the thing to build off that you said really nicely is when you need to. You're going to work with faculties that are really solid on the elements. You don't need to. But when people have not had a lot of exposure, they get nervous. There's a dual thing, like, oh, I'm not exactly sure what the assessment is. I'm not exactly sure. And they're also thinking about what is it I'm actually teaching. So if you can set aside what they're actually teaching, just the teacher in all of us is like, look, these are what these elements are. We are very, very committed to color coding because we think it absolutely very quickly gets people to see that you just don't put filler in there. It needs to align internally. And so that's another piece. But it is useful. I'm glad you asked too. I agree. And Marie's description was right on point. It was really, really solid. Is that helpful, Sarah?
I think that's great. Absolutely. We actually have another question here that I think builds off of what Marie was just sharing with the fork map. Christine is asking, do you have any suggestions for a template or a format for a high school curriculum map for the less techie teacher? So I guess if the panelists can address, what elements did you include in your curriculum maps? Like what were those, maybe those main sections that filled out a template if you used one, and what they were?
We built ours against the Danielson rubric. That's the rubric that was board voted on for staff evaluation. And so we pulled the planning sections from domain 1, and we just kept it super simple, set standards, content, procedures and assessment, and made it as simple as possible so that, we could check very easily for alignment to standard, but then we can spend some time in that procedures. It's 1E at the top of my head, where we could take a look and make sure that they're hitting our big ones, engagement, student-to-student interaction, and, other elements.
Thanks, Lisa. Does anyone else want to jump in and add sort of the elements of your templates that you use for your curriculum maps?
We were very basic too, with unit overview, standards, but also learning objectives, which caused some teachers to question what's the difference. So we had, again, it was a chance to explain, here's standards, but here's learning objectives and what those mean. And I'll say, when we started this in 2016, Keenan was very helpful in helping us to design a simple template that we actually took back to our focus group to say, take a look at this. Does this look like this would work for our disciplines? And then that's the one we went forward with.
That's great. And just to address that, our chalk team is great. We're happy to work with the districts and schools however possible. We also have a built-in template as a default for anyone who's brand new to curriculum mapping, is no idea where to start. So sometimes that's helpful to have that starting off point too. A couple of you also mentioned standards, and where's that question? Laura was asking, how do you all work with standards updates? So maybe you've made your maps and they've all aligned to the standards, and then suddenly the standards are all being updated and you kind of need to go through them again. The example specifically that they give is the College Board 2020 updates to standards. Can anyone address that? Maybe Michael?
Well, being an AP teacher, I'm becoming very familiar that when I first started teaching AP in 2004, their curriculum framework rarely ever changed. And then now it's almost every year they're tweaking, so I can appreciate that. So I guess for us, the benefit that we've had with chalk is that when there have been big changes to standards, I've contacted Keenan and he's helped me get them put in as a bank. And then in my role as vice principal of academics, as I oversee curriculum. So what I've been doing this year is, for example, all the math standards in Florida just changed and they'll be implemented next year. As I worked with the math teachers and I said, you know what, I'm going to put your map in a draft form and I'm going to go take the banks of standards and I'm going to put them in for you in there, not aligning which units because the teachers will decide where that goes, but I'm going to help them with the legwork and walk through them, making that new alignment. And so that's part of our curriculum auditing and revision is that we're going to the state site and just making sure that we're still in line, because sometimes the state of Florida sneaks things in that we want to check.
One question I have, and it kind of goes back to the previous question on elements. I've really come in my career to believe that we should be streamlining more in the curriculum and design. It should be much easier to use. I do think, though, that in good design, elements need to be present. There's just so many different ways. Like you talk about writing a short story, there's character, plot, and setting. You wouldn't just say there's characters. You really need all of those. And so I think the discussion really is what you're using your maps for. And the examples we just heard, you were very clear on your purpose. I'm all in on streamlining. I think that makes sense. If I'm trying to look at a full design, I think what you're looking at is you are making choices in the curriculum about what the content will be. It's a big question because you're going to leave out things. Whose history do you leave out? I know that course in global. Oh my gosh, you're talking global. We all know the Regents focuses on certain things. There are things you won't. What books do you leave out? It matters, What skills are you working on? What proficiencies? You can have the element of essential questions. We like them, but you don't have to. I get that. But I'll tell you one that I think is real important is you got to have some evidence in there. What does this look like? Does that assessment really look like? And when you mention standards, the one thing, and I'd be curious if you agree, you may not, and that's totally legit, of course. It seems to us that standards aren't really taught. That's not their purpose. They're to be demonstrated. In other words, it's all well and good if I say, oh, I taught this standard. The key here is what are the kids, how do they demonstrate it? So in the map, maybe there's a place where you guys deal or you put where your assessments are, but it seems to me that it's the selection and placement of those standards across the year and their demonstration. And that's the teacher's decision. That's going to be really where it happens. But I'm curious about if you see assessment as a critical element in the maps and what you think their relationship is to the standards. So it's not a checklist. You know what I mean? It's not like, check, I taught the standard. Standard is living and breathing in the curriculum. The kids demonstrate it. What do you think? Does that ring true to you, or I don't know? I'm just curious what you all think.
I would say this is one of the most critical places that needs to be in a map. And I continually, sorry, I think I'm getting a message. I'm being a little unstable, so sorry if it's garbly. I think that teaching staff how to connect the content and how we're measuring student learning is so critical. And that assessment piece does that. And we talked a little bit about, what were the teachers most concerned about? They were sometimes concerned about addressing that assessment piece because what if the kids got their tests? Or what if, that we let the hat out of the bag, because someone might find the answers to our test. And so they were reluctant to kind of talk about assessment a little bit, but then we had to reframe it of it's not assessment just for a grade, but assessment of learning. And so what kinds of assessment do we have in there? Because there's such pressure to assess students for a grade.
True. Yeah, I mean, we look at standards as the content and skills, right? The what and the how of driving learning. And so, using formative and summative assessment is critical in the classroom right on the level. And I think, not having that gauge is, where things can go wrong very quickly. And people end up making independent decisions that are not aligned to mission, vision, but then also big overarching picture. And then you have, that's where you have, I think, Dan, you talked about it before, where people have different ideas of what a unit is or what goes into the unit. And, those are the kinds of things that we want to avoid. And so I always start, if we're going to start something new, what do you want the finished product to be? What do you want the students to actually do with all of this, so that we can pick the standards and then the content and skills from them that are the most appropriate. So if we always start from that top, it's almost like, a UVD approach, then we can start developing a scale and a basic skeleton for a body of a plan that then teachers can go forth and, do different things with. But I think, not having those as the backbone, as Jennifer was talking about, creates chaos essentially, because you've got too many cooks then making independent decisions that may not necessarily be the best ones.
I'd like to jump back to Jennifer. You mentioned about the concern of teachers and their assessment questions, and I see that that's popular in the chat right now. That was something we had some of our teachers, they said, are we going to have to upload our test questions to this, because who might be able to see it? And I said, well, for the assessment part of your curriculum map, really you need to have a conversation about what you're trying to assess without revealing the test itself. So for an English department, what they found in their conversation is that some teachers were doing mostly all multiple choice and some were doing more writing, and they needed to have some kind of agreement on how much are we asking the students to write, to reflect, to do literary analysis, or is it content driven? So we tried to shift that conversation to quality assessment that matches what we're trying to learn as reflected in our curriculum map. And then I said, where you actually, if you have common assessments, we can store those securely somewhere else. That doesn't have to be as an attachment in the curriculum map, as long as those assessments then match. What we wanted to see for our assessment section is, what's the purpose of assessment? What are we trying to, how are we going to assess to identify that the students actually learned what we set out for them to learn?
That's a really good point. And I think the other piece of that is if there are things that don't need to be secrets, right? So like we have rubrics or we have project-based evaluation tools. Students need to know those. They need to know what the expectation is. So those were the types of things that we tried to get into Chalk. because that was important for everyone to kind of have that shared expectation. But when we talk about PD, that's what the work of curriculum writing is, your PD, because that's exactly what happens. We then start talking about what's the quality of our assessments and what are we doing. And that really aligns what we're doing with assessment.
You know, it's interesting. This is a really interesting point. I mean, I think the word assessment gets reductive. That when you say assessment, everyone immediately thinks of those texts that I think you spoke very candidly about, Michael, and we saw a whole slew of people going, yeah, everyone's scared. And the truth is, the majority of the more demanding standards, and at all levels they're demanding, there's no test you could ever design that would show evidence of those. You couldn't. It's impossible. Let me just give you a perfect example. If in 4th and 5th grade, in ELA, it says students will be able to state a claim, find evidence, support that claim, and convince an audience. You can't come up with a multiple choice test or even a constructive response. They actually have to go out and play the game. They actually have to go do it. There's a misunderstanding between demonstrations of learning, which is really the much broader view of assessment. And when we go assessment, everyone's thinking the end of the test, or the end of your test, or even something like the Regents, which is a very good examination, but it's limited. And so maybe part of it is opening up, and I think mapping allows you to do that. Like, let's look at all the different forms of evidence we need, that these kids are going to need to demonstrate it, because it can be very rich, as opposed to, feeling that sense of protectiveness. These are great comments. They're really interesting. Anyone else on this? I'm looking at the time too, but this is a really good one on this question of.
A big part of what we ran into during the pandemic was this integrity conversation, and not just keeping track of the assessments, but even when I was having the students take the assessments and the design of assessments that could have accountability, if I wasn't actually in the room with the children while they were taking it, or the idea of I wasn't in full control of the assessment items before I put them out there. There were concerns of the parents seeing what the assessment was and things like that. So one of the things we started to do to improve the accountability of all of our assessments, regardless of the design, because I think it's hard to say to people, well, everything has to be a project, right? Or you have to turn everything into something that has a rubric. But we started to add things like reflections at the ends of certain questions, or at the ends of certain assessments, or even survey questions before the child. Like, what is your confidence level of graphing this equation without using technology, right? Really getting information from students that they can't prepare ahead of time and that they can't look up and use on, like Wolfram Alpha or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of including a lot more reflection and really maybe changing the design of our assessment items so that it is really not a concern of whether it's secret or not.
That was a big thing for us too during COVID, having good, authentic assessment. And I think it really exposed for a lot of teachers, what is my assessment really assessing? And is it getting at what I'm trying to get at? Or am I just asking them to, answer a couple multiple choice questions? And so we actually went along those same lines as you just described, where we had teachers who would have the question that might have been on the test when the kid was sitting in front of them. But the next question was, record yourself a Flipgrid and post that screencast or whatever it is of you describing the thought process that got you here. And what were the building blocks that led you to this answer, and actually having that discussion about our assessments. It was nice having, our maps starting to get laid out in front of us all, because in a lot of cases in that nice box that says assessment, there were some maps that said, we will assess with formative assessment and summative assessment, and, teacher created questions that didn't, and so both those things together really helped get our district's mind in that mindset of how do I want to assess the children, and am I having them demonstrate their learning, or am I just looking for a response to a single question?
Daniel,
show your work.
I gotta hop on, because I actually would just say this. I don't think that's what your teachers were answering. I think they were answering a much more important question. not how do I want to assess. But kids learn by going through the process of looking at feedback and knowing how to improve their performance. Your example was perfect. It's more, how can my kids get the most out of this assessment? Too often it's like, I've got the test, I've got to give it to them. Then I post it in the grade book and the kids are going, what just happened to me? They can feel like almost like it's an assault. You know what I mean? Like, and so that last example was music to my ears. I just loved it. It's like, you're going to actually take this, but you get to learn something from this that you can go with. I mean, that's the whole point. That was great. It was a great example. How are we doing, Sarah?
We're great. I've just been letting this conversation flow. It's been great. We do have another couple questions to go through though. Someone's asking about the pacing guide that everyone's been using. I know it's hard to kind of physically show your pacing guide right now, but if you can maybe talk a little bit about how you did determine pacing or create that pacing guide that then people were able to follow. If you did have something that was sort of across the board or more specific to teachers, if you could address that a little bit, I think that would be great.
That was a point of anxiety in our district when this was rolling out, because a lot thought that, you know, the ones who were looking at the bulletins and not listening to what we were saying were seeing it as, you're telling me when I have to teach it and how long I have to spend on it and when do I move on to the next topic. But that was my decision in the classroom. And so that was a conversation that we had to have and talk about, where no, this is a consensus. We're looking at this map together as a department, or you as the expert in your shop, of just, we're trying to keep the end in mind and know how long it's going to take to get there. And that's something we can refine, since we have a tool that's so easily collaborative and adaptable, where we can just change this. If we find this isn't matching expectation, we can just change it. You know, use our experimental classroom as something that helps us modify this every single day, if not every single year. So that's definitely something to think about, and how you market it in the buy-in phase of your teachers when you're rolling out mapping. But I don't think it's something that you should fear will hold things up, as long as you approach it in the right way.
I've always taken it from like the approach that, for us, because we're semester based and because we have to really be very mindful of our chunking and content focus for our students, that, within each semester, typically our teachers are here in a number of years. And so, the idea is, let's be reflective of this now, so that when you come back to it next fall, for example, you can make those changes and know, oh, I needed more time for unit 2, or I needed more time for this, or less time for that. And so we can have these like really quick conversations as we go through, and I give my bi-weekly feedback. Someone can say, I'll look at their pacing and say, hey, I see you're a little behind. Do you find, how much more time do you think you'll need? It's not, oh, you're not in the map, this is off time, all that. It's just more of like, all right, so how are we going to make the adjustment? Well, how much more time do you need for it to be meaningful, rather than like racing through something for the sake of racing through it? So I think that's an important conversation to have. And then the teacher doesn't feel like they're being spoon-fed this thing that they have to do, but that they also have autonomous decisions based on their expertise on the ground.
That's great. Thank you. I think that answers that question very well, of the different considerations there for pacing. There's a lot of moving parts with that, as you both touched on. And then I'm going to direct this one actually back to you, Lisa, as well, because I know you mentioned today how you've had people give direct feedback to lessons that teachers were developing. So somebody's asking, did any of the panelists here today, your schools, your districts, incorporate Planboard, which for those who are attending who don't know, is the instructional lesson planning side of Chalk services? So did you incorporate Planboard as you were implementing Chalk, or did you maybe just start with curriculum mapping and then bring the lesson plan side in later?
Nope, was the Band-Aid. We ripped it right off. We
All
did
or
everything
nothing.
all at once.
Second.
Our folks, like we had started with an archaic system. So when we moved over to Chalk and Planboard, it was much easier, especially with the Google Doc type of scenario. So it's a lot easier for folks to just kind of work right in the document to use. Jennifer talked about this too, the comment feature, like that's one of the biggest things that we use for our co-planning too, because we have a lot of push-ins. We have a very high special ed and English language learner population. So our support staff can go right in, pull a lesson plan, throw in a few more resources if they're missing, and everything's kind of happening right on the ground. So it was a lot easier for folks to do that instead of taking this, going to Google Docs, sharing an email or back and forth. It's right in there. It happens all at once, and they have plenty of time to kind of confer and make changes as they go.
No, yeah, we didn't say it. We ripped the Band-Aid right off. But there was thought put into it. We did think about this, and Chalk even cautioned us, sometimes people just start with the map and then move to the planner. But what we found was the whole thing that we needed to move forward with in our mapping process was improving the actual implementation, the use of the map in the classroom. And so it just made sense to bring the plan board along with the mapping solution, because it put the map right in front of the teachers every day in their lesson plan where they were doing the work every day. And so it just made sense to just rip the Band-Aid off and go forward with both in the one fell swoop.
We scaled it. We did, the mapping was our focus for 2 years, but I introduced Plan Board to start. So all of our teachers prior to that had been required to have unit plans and what they called pacing guides, but really they were lesson plans in Word documents on the internal server that nobody looked at. So I introduced Plan Board and said, as a classroom teacher myself, so it was right before I became an administrator, I was teaching 6 classes, 3 preps. They were all different periods of the day. So I shared my Plan Board was my savior, because I had a different lesson every class period. By the way, the schedule fell that last year I taught full time. So Plan Board was my savior to know, what am I teaching next in an hour? Because it was always different. So I shared that with them and said, we're going to focus on the curriculum mapping because that's the most important piece right now as a school, but you're welcome to adopt Plan Board. And so it really kind of started from the ground naturally, that as more teachers started using the Plan Board side, they said, wow, this is so nice. I can save it from year to year and then tie it to the curriculum map. And then once we felt pretty confident in our curriculum map, then we really shifted our focus to Plan Board, which is where we're at now.
That's great. And of course, we're happy to help with all sides of the pre-planning stage, whether that's curriculum mapping or lesson planning, the planning that gets the teachers to the classroom to deliver their content to the students, right? But I think that concludes all of the questions that we had here today. Does anyone have any final thoughts they'd like to share before we sign off?
I think there's a little bit of in a lot of the questions, there's been a lot of Q&A on the back end of this, and in the chat, I encourage all the participants to check that out before they leave. But there was one question about this idea of balancing the need to know and the maybe it'd be nice to know. And I think that when you're going through the curriculum mapping process, and Heidi has said it very often, it's that you're really going after the answer to 2 questions. Where is consistency required for student success? And back 2 weeks ago, we talked about that vertical alignment or looking for gaps and that confidence in a non-negotiable curriculum. And then the second question is, where is flexibility required for student success? And there's this articulation of the autonomy of teachers to make the right choices in the moment with the students, and even to include the students in the process of designing their own curriculum. And we've been hearing it in the chat, and we've been hearing it in the questions and throughout today. And I would love to see another panel discussion where we go deeper into this balance. But as a quick summary, it's being clear as a district about the answers to those questions where you get the confidence. It's not one or the other. And we heard about the fear, right? Teachers being afraid of losing that. So it's about clarity and transparency, which is what curriculum mapping was always about and getting to those conversations. So I want to thank everybody for their participation in this and revealing and getting to the heart of it, because now you are in the where the payback comes from doing curriculum mapping, right? It's in getting to that question. So we're so happy for all of you. We ended too soon. So thank you.
Thank you, Chalk. Thanks, everyone. Beautifully said, Marie. That was great.
Yes, thank you. So thank you to our wonderful panelists and our moderators today for sharing your knowledge and experiences in today's panel discussion. And of course, thank you to all of the attendees who joined us today and for your amazing questions that helped our discussion continue. Today's session and the series is brought to you by Chalk. Chalk is a planning and analytics platform that enables K-12 schools and districts to develop a cohesive, standards-aligned map for curriculum and instruction. To learn more about Chalk or to get support on your curriculum initiatives, please visit chalk.com/demo. We have had a couple of questions today of how Chalk sort of can help with specific areas. By booking a demo, we can really show you exactly how Chalk and our services can help with your specific needs and interests for curriculum mapping and lesson planning. Thank you everyone so much for joining today. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye.